All right, so let's just chat real fast as to what's going to happen for week 6. And welcome everybody. Hopefully, everyone had a good week and being able to draw many of the items that you had to maybe encounter for the homework for this session. As we can see, we start with some of the weaponry and the handheld items that we kind of covered. So we'll go through some of the stuff in the homework later on today, as usual. And today we're going to just focus on the back to the organic side on studies. And usually what happens is I tend to kind of mix the two subjects where I usually would separate them, but just to kind of give you guys extra content, I usually would mix these two, which is the bone structure and land animals. So we had done week 3, our first introduction of an animal going to bugs, but that was more for just primitive forms, minimal details. Then from there, we went into things like marine life. So we've had a good chunk of living animals for sure so far. This last week was about, again, smaller objects. Today we'll focus on bone structure and land animals. Next week, week 7, will be on a vehicle. So we'll focus on a vehicle structure, potentially dual. So we may do things like cars and military kind of vehicle forms, just to kind of cover those ranges of things. If anything else, it kind of opens up the search on being able to actually draw many assortment of stuff instead of just a similar kind of vehicle over and over again. And then going into week 8 will be our final day, so we'll have our lectures for that session, and of course any additional straggling topic or subject you might want to cover. We'll also, of course, do reviews of week 8, not only on just a homework, but a presentation. So today is week 6, so I might even consider talking about that today, about what the presentation will be. It's pretty straightforward. All it is just making sure that you select a few of the key pieces from each week and putting it together into another presentation. And it kind of shows the overall performance of the term. So I'll come back and remind you guys of that later on. Let's see, we are going to start up on skeletal structure first. Let's get a new file going. All right, get the right brush. This is week 6, so we are winding down to our last 2 weeks here real soon. Topic for today, I'm going to focus on the skeletal structures and land animals. Now, of course, there's such a broad assortment of animals that we could be looking at, and we only have so much time on being able to talk about the variety of them. So we're going to kind of focus it towards some of the more common animals that we can observe, let's say at like a zoo, or things that we're generally familiar with. So certain type of equine animals like zebras, horses, that kind of such thing, towards even possibly big cats. Any other animals that we can think of will be considered, but for the moment, was focus on a single or dual here and there, just as the demo and the example. And so that way you can try to marry those things in terms of information or approach towards other animals that you'll encounter, which would be similar in terms of a breakdown and how you would try to problem solve it. So let's see, skeletal structure, animals, and of course referencing we'll be looking at first. So let me grab just the browser. And we'll focus on one animal initially. So I think to start with, let's see, let's start with an animal like, what should we do? Would you rather see like an equine animal, like a horse, something like this, or would you rather see like a big cat? I guess is a question, because those two are always the archetypes of things that we can always generally use that bridges well to other animals. If there's one specific you'd rather see, one or the other, then you can let me know. If it doesn't really matter, I'll just choose one. I typically do like things like zebras a lot of the times, but yeah, big cat would be kind of fun then. Let's choose big cats. Big cat skeleton. Now, the big cats on the planet of what we have around the regions of our continents range quite dramatically in terms of animals of size, scale. Of course, you'll find the largest big cats, you know, in the areas of Africa. But of course, you will find big cats thrown around different parts of Asia. But a lot of them today, modern day wise, have started to recede, almost be gone completely. Like the big, large Siberian cats that do still exist in very small numbers, used to roam many parts of Asia down to even all the way down to Japan. This is, of course, many, many hundreds of years ago. They used to dominate areas like in China and Korea, and they were completely wiped out. No, probably not that long ago, probably what 100 years ago now. We're talking about the 1940s, 30s is when they're doing a large, a big eradication and big hunts of big cats of tigers in Korea and also different parts of China. It was all hunting, just they wiped them out of game. So we start to see animals like this over here that were widely distributed, but now lost. Let's see. Let's take a look at just a simple shot like this one here. The one over here with the anatomy breakdown is a great reference, by the way. So if you want to know some basic bone structure information, you can definitely use this information over here. Let's just grab this one for the moment, though. That's going to be a good shot to study from. We'll also take a different angle of view. Let's see if we can find the shot. Most of these, are very kind of just crappy photos because they're just models or toys of things. Let's see. We have a nice one with a pose, but this is more for 3D model, which is okay. 3D models are good to use if you want to use them. So of course, going to places like Sketchfab, you should be able to find the full 3D models of big cats, and also animals of muscle structure. This is actually a skeletal structure from a museum that's here in LA. This is at the Page Museum or the tar pits, the La Brea tar pits. So we can probably find some good images here of these. And this is a large lion that actually was North American lion. And this is, of course, back in the prehistoric times of large mammals. Let's see, trying to find a different angle if we can get a good one. It's a nice shot right there. Image quality is kind of poor, but maybe we can find something similar. It's not too bad either. Kind of like these shots with what's coming towards the camera like that. That's pretty cool. Let's get that shot right there. All right, so we have a side view, slight 3/4, more 3/4. This is of probably an African lion as well too. Let's see, it says name over here, I think. No, it doesn't say it. But of course, the bone structure of big cats, from the lions to the tigers, will be pretty similar. There are minute differences based on skull structure or size and scale of certain things. Let's see if there's anything else we can maybe use. Well, I think the skulls over here are also very nice examples just for head study later on. From there, let's go to, let's say, big cats. We can focus on a tiger. No, not tiger cats. Let's do like, how about the Siberian? Dinosaurs actually, the bone structure for the Natural History Museum is a focus of what we do. We start with the prehistoric animals first. We will do things like dinosaurs, prehistoric mammals, and then we would do modern day animals, So, when it comes to the skeletal structure for this week, is it allowed for you guys to study things like dinosaurs? It is. Even though we don't necessarily have, examples of what dinosaurs would have looked like at the time, the bone structure is something we can observe, So if you guys actually wanted to focus on some of those in the beginning, just for skeletal structure study, this is about shape building, all that kind of stuff, then you potentially be able to, you would actually be able to do so. Most of you will most likely focus on things like live animals for now, but as I said, you'd be welcome to look at some of those if you want. I'm just looking for right now a quick side view pose and a couple of 3/4 shots over here with the animal. We have a lot of laying down poses, but we do have a couple of standing shots. I just don't want it to be a front shot. I want there to be a slight 3/4 turn or just a nice side view. But most of the photographs you'll see always end up being where the tiger is looking directly at the camera, or the photographer being, directly in front of them in some ways. That's a nice shot right there. I could probably just grab that one. Not grab it, but just take a look at it. Find a shot that's similar or in an angle. So here's a nice 3/4 view. Let's see, let's just pull this one for now. Kind of like these ones also with a bit of action and movement. There, that's pretty good. And then one last one, which is a side view. Nice head study. Side view of the tiger. We have one that's kind of walking right here. Let's see if we can find one in a standing pose. That's not too bad either. That's pretty good. Usually if you find the big cats with their heads kind of more low, horizontal, but this one has his head a little bit higher up, which is kind of nice of a drawing. That's actually a pretty good one too. More of a standard walk pose. His ears are back though, which is kind of interesting. All right, that should be good enough. So let's start to grab some of these images and bring them over. Nara, welcome. Let's go with the side view first here. This one is the one from the Page Museum. It's a great museum if you guys ever get a chance and things start to open up more again, to come to LA and see certain museums. We have two here. The Natural History Museum obviously is the go-to, and it's a pretty solid museum as a place to go observe and draw and see some specimens and whatnot. The Natural History Museum in LA has a pretty good selection and departments of things. However, I feel like they lack some things as well too. I don't really feel like their spaces used as well as it could be, but they do have a good assortment of other stuff. They do focus heavily a lot on like what LA does. Well, in terms of like Los Angeles history and stuff like that, which sounds typical to like what most museums do, focus on a city that they do. But of course, I'm more interested in things like world cultures and actual examples of things that can come from biology and examples of specimens. We'll bring in the live cat later on, actually. Oops. All right, so skeletal land animals, side view, proportion being priority. This particular week, it can be difficult for some people. And this is due to the bone structure being so complex and numerous when it comes to details and information. For you, you're going to sit there and try to observe every single bit of bone. And we can't necessarily do that, okay? We want to be able to, of course, streamline a lot of the information. We want to be able to understand the shapes and information of stuff with accuracy, proportion, but not with this sense of overthinking of those elements of details, trying to capture what it actually looks like. If we're doing, let's say, a one-to-one anatomical study, that's one thing, right? As an anatomical study, understanding the actual bits of bone and what they visually actually look like, we want to be as close as we can as actual anatomy study. Here, for proportion study of shape and form, a bit different though. Again, we're looking for the general length of things like length, height, the placement of those joints, proportional fixtures and whatnot, but still, the simplicity of some of the grouping is so that the readability is there. And for also memorization, through that simplicity, we can then also apply that level of anatomical detail if you were trying to go that route. So if I want to do a one-to-one anatomical study, even regardless of that, I would still want to start simple initially and build it to something with much more definition of that anatomy as I went along. So, back in art center classes, we used to do like, anatomy classes for humans, and we would do as close as we can to actual anatomical study as possible. So we will normally get a book on anatomy, and we will find in that book things like illustrations and actual examples of bone structure, muscles, ligament, joints, of not only just the whole body, but also different parts. And then we would do one-to-one copies from them. Literally, we'd be out of the book, not tracing them, of course, but we copy them onto vellum paper using pencils. We have our sketchbook, and we have our textbook next to it, and we would literally just do a copy as close as possible as you can. The instructor would then judge things like accuracy of the proportioning and accuracy of the bone structure and muscles inside there. But we would try to capture as best we can just visually, but again, that's where we're actually taking into account of spending an entire week of rendering that drawing, looking at the bone structure and trying to copy literally every single bit of bone into it. But here we want to be able to not only draw a single piece for render, but a multitude of studies now, right? All right, so here, much like with the fish that we started from last time, we had the concept of the balloon and the string, right? So with the balloon and string can be applied in the same method, and the balloon represents, again, the cranial structure, cranium of the skull. And we also then have the spine or vertebrae. As a reminder, this balloon does not represent the entire skull, okay? It is the cranial inner structure. It's the brain case of the skull. So back to, let's say, like a human being, if I drew the human skull again, the top portion is what our balloon is. So as we then have the other compartments from the nasal cavity down to the mandible, finding things like the bridge to the chin, applying things like where the orbital socket to the nasal cavity, cheekbone down to the muzzle. Is what that represents, the balloon. So in any animal of bone structure study that we're going for, we're looking first for where that inner cranial structure is. Again, that balloon's shape and size can vary from animal to animal, depending on what you're looking at. But like I said, this is based on if you want to apply this type of thing. Give it a try and see if it does work for you. Other times people don't find it, visually appropriate, so they might want to go with something else. For instance, you could go for the entire shape of the skull, which could be potentially something more plano like this, splitting up and finding different areas and compartments of things like shapes of mandible to skull and cranium. So either way, starting off with a simplistic shape is what you want to go for. For me, to control scale of the drawing, it is the balloon. Okay, so I start with the inner cranium. This helps me dictate the size of the drawing. From there, I'm going to go to the neck, which is a string into the spine, and I'm judging by eye the general length and change of these areas. Okay, so the tail will go that direction somewhere. Now this still gives me room on being able to adjust proportion if need be. So if I find that, let's say, okay, I think I need to make the length of the body a bit longer, I want to try to do so. When it comes to the neck, right now the position might be a bit too short. I'll bring it down a little bit lower, bring it up like that. So I can adjust proportioning if I still need to. Even if you have to redraw some areas and not feel overly concerned of it, like taking over the quality of the drawing, because it'll start to be disguised with the additional constructions of things that are there. As I have the balloon and string for this side view, this next application is one that tends to throw people not really off a little bit, but it's just more of a sense of like seeing what I'm seeing, okay? So like I said, you'll either see it or you won't, or you'll attempt it and you'll find your routes as well too. So what I'm gonna look for next, and I'll draw it real quickly here, is parts of the body. And I'm drawing 3 shapes right now, 3 circles. Now these circles, when people look at them, wonder, it's like, okay, are these the shapes of the actual bones here, right? So this must be the hip bone, and this must be the rib bone or rib structure, but it's not necessarily the case. I do have a count, 1, 2, 3, in the area of the body section. Now, what do those shapes represent is the location of where those bones will exist. They are not the actual shapes of the bones themselves. So the first circle does not represent the shape of the scapula, okay? It is the location of the joint structure, the front joint structure. The secondary shape is the location of where the ribs will be. But the bone structure obviously, could be larger or smaller or a different placement in the area of what I located for those circles. So 3 is just the location of where the hip bone may exist, but the shape of the hip bone obviously will be different and will lie within that spot. So these circles that I've drawn are locations like on a map. This is the location where it can possibly exist within what I'm trying to go to, right? Somewhere inside there. It can expand outside of it or work inside of it. But the idea is that this is a general location of where that anatomy of bone structure exists for me to also judge proportion, all right? So what I can do now is indicate things like, well, I see the front scapula, and I'm going to just draw one side of the bone, not both parts. I'm going to also indicate things like a joint. Scapula moves up in that direction, and we'll draw in the shape of the scapula. I'm going to use something more plano, like this. Shapes that are more like triangular right there. There's a joint structure, which is for the front pair of limbs. I can also now draw in the shape of the rib cage, which is a bit more of a flatter sternum right there with a bit of a round portion. So again, number 2 represents the location of the ribs. However, I can draw outside of it to better encapsulate and also capture the accuracy of the rib cage. We see this nice lateral line on the body right there, which is, you'll see the joint structure right there on the rib cage. That is for added flexibility for the ribs. So as humans, we also have areas like that too, like little segmented parts of the ribs. So our ribs can compress and expand as we breathe. It's not just a rigid bone, or else they could snap and break much easier. Then we also have then the hip bone structure. So there's a bit of a straight line right there, and just a shape of angles on the bottom. And there is a joint structure above, slightly, a bit higher. I'm going to locate where the joint structure is located, right there, joint and joint. So at the angle of it, the back joint is slightly higher if I connect those 2 lines. So again, coming back to the bone structure here, this joint to this joint, draw the line in, you'll see the angle such. So using these imaginary lines to connect landmarks, things like joint structures, placement of certain bones, can help you with the accuracy proportion-wise by noticing where they lie, again, in comparison to each other. With this, I'm going to just draw lines for bone here to a joint. How do I know where this ends? Well, again, I'm going to try to use visual lines, landmarks, to create negative space. So for instance, from here to, let's say, the rib cage, we'll create this negative shape. So in the image in the photograph, same thing. Here to here, we'll create that negative shape. And those will give me a sense of like where this joint, this elbow, will sit. As I go to the back leg, let's just choose, of course, one leg for now at the moment. As that joint comes down from this joint to that knee joint, coming back, I want to connect those 2 together. You start to see there's a slight angle to it. Again, from this joint to that joint. As I go all the way down to the forearms. Same thing. From here, I'm going to create a visual line from the top of the shoulder to see this triangle. Same thing from this wrist structure down. So I can do that with the back leg also. Okay, so then the paws come downward. Ground plane is here. Then we have the heel to the foot. Tail goes that direction. So proportionally, I was relatively comfortable with what I established. Now it's easy to make it too short, easy to make it really long. So we have to obviously continue to do possibly multiple iterations to get as close as we can. Let's stop right there. I'm going to copy and paste this one, just so we know that we can understand one version and variation of it. The idea to repeat will help us build a better sense of what's going on for the anatomy's proportion. So with this, the second iteration, as I repeat all those steps again, adjusting anything on position, length, proportion, all that kind of stuff, I can now let's connect those joints right there. You can start to see the parallels within this joint, and then this joint here. These lines are parallel right now. I'm going to go back to the skull real fast. And on top of the circle, I'm going to build the top portion of the skull. Okay, not the entire skull with the mandible, but just the upper portion. Using shapes that are straights, angular, plano. For me, I prefer plano shapes for skulls. Much like in the insects and the bugs, also a lot of plano shapes. As you'll notice with most of my animal structures in general have been more plano and geoforms, boxes and trapezoids and that kind of stuff. I will still use rounded organic shapes in some areas. A lot of those come down to like the inner skull or the head structure at the inside part, and I build something more plano around it, essentially. Here, the lower portion of the mandible coming down, connecting the front ends down together, find the angle itself, the degree, lower mandible. Individual parts, things like the skeletal structures of the spine, vertebrae, things like even the scapula to the arm bones. I'll start to now draw in shapes that represent those areas. But I'm not going to draw the bone as one-to-one. Some of these bone structures I'll just draw as boxes. Some of them might taper. Some of them might have slight angles or turns to them. But in general, it won't capture the actual bone, or like finding the details of all those little end pieces and trying to find the little bumps and changes that happen with the bone, right? So I start simply first, then I convert it into something more natural looking, okay? Here down to the paw, again, just a grouping of all the metacarpals and the bone of the fingers. Top of the vertebrae juts up a little bit. Here's the inner spine structure right there. Again, the idea is not to draw every single tiny little bone right now. I'm going to group it together into one continuous silhouette shape. So even in the rib cage, even though I can see all those individual ribs, do I want you to draw and count every single rib right now? It's not very fun, okay? So of course, like I said, if you're doing an anatomical study, that's one thing. I'm just going to use lines for the cross contouring to show you how it turns around the rib, but those don't actually indicate individual bones, right? Back to the hips. General hip structure I'm actually okay with. Let's go down to the thigh bone. To then the ankle, to the foot. Boxes and shapes. Back of the tail. And it's a 2D silhouette drawing. That is as much information as you'll need, because it's about proportion. It's about making sure things are just appropriate when it comes to observing and bridging things over, but also to help memorize things. To memorize this will be a bit more approachable compared to memorize every single bone of that in the animal. It's like, well, that's just so much information. We have over 200 plus bones in some of these things. Again, the same thing with a human skeleton. It's just there's so much information and so many bits and pieces. As an anatomical study, it's the memorization of all those bones, which is very overwhelming. But in terms of like simplicity, by saying, okay, I just want to draw things based on shape, it helps us be able to process the information that's in front of us with a little bit more ease, So let's try this one over here, what has a different pose. You know what, actually, let's go with the bottom pose, this one, because it's something visually much more interesting. So let's try the balloon and string approach again. So the balloon represents the inner part of the skull, string, back into the tail, goes back that direction. Okay, so what I'm seeing right now is balloon, string. There's an S curve in there. From this portion, I'm going to mark off right here where the front shape of number 1 is located, which is then overlapped by number 2. Hips are real close and behind to number 2 as well. It's actually overlapping it a little bit. So again, what I'm seeing at the moment is this 1, 2, 3. So number 1 represents that front section of the bone structure, the joints for those front pair of arms. That's what 1 represents, right in there, okay? So as I continue, I'm going to mark off things like, I can see that the front joints can be marked off here and here. Let's get a line that represents the direction of the scapula. 1 goes there, 1 goes here. let's get the lines for the limbs, which comes down this direction, down that direction for the elbows to connect. Visually creating lines, you see the spacing, negative space in between them. Negative space in between those. Down to the forearms, which tapers inwardly. The right arm is a little bit more forward than the left one. Slight amount. Paws come out this way. As I have the rib structure, I want to find the central sternum, which is jutting out. So this line represents this line here. It's hard to see sometimes, and what you have to do is also just observe. Just look at it, you know, and see what's actually happening. You'll see that the sternum, the front, sorry, hold on. Here we go. The front sternum jumps this direction. We have the inner rib cage right here. Okay, there's an ellipse inside this area. Central line cuts that part in half. This is the central line for the sternum of the ribs. You'll find that lateral line on the side of the rib cage right there. So it turns into basically a joint and turns. Joint, turns, turns. Most mammals will have that. So right now going into this again, finding the rib cage, going back this direct. I find that the rib cage is it's a little bit too large in what I drew, so I'm gonna actually adjust and change it a little bit. I'm gonna bring it in and collapse it. As it comes down, the central part of the sternum goes up in this manner. This is then the shape of the rib cage's front ellipse. This also then changes potentially the position of the hip bone. So I want to redraw the positioning of where the hips will go. Hips will jut out like this direction over here. It's slightly then overlapped by the rib cage behind it. So then the joint structure will stick out from there on the legs. So the circle that I drew initially was here for the hips, but I moved the hip structure inwardly a little bit, this part here. But the bone structure sticks in to the side for the leg. There's a joint here, joint there for the front, joint there for the back. There's the angle for it, angle for it. Back leg then comes down a little bit more forward, taking the elbow to the knee, looking for that line of sight. It does line up like this, a little bit lower. They're kind of closer, so I'm gonna actually move that a bit closer here. Again, I redrew the line. I'm not gonna go in there and erase that line or undo it for you. I'm gonna leave it where it is, okay? Because you might think, well, now that's a mistake. You know, I was like, what do I do with that part? I'm gonna leave it because I'm gonna reuse it later on. So here's the knee joint. As it comes back, looking at this angle to this angle, connecting those dots. Point here to point there, connect those dots, right? Look for these inner triangles. To the back of the actual heel, down to the foot. This will create basically a perspective line. The other leg is right behind the front leg. You can't even see it because it's being covered up, but the bone structure does come forward behind the rib cage here. Joint stops there, but it completely is overlapped by the front forearm, front arm itself, so you can't really see it. But the leg foot positioning is right about there. You'll see it in the photograph here. That's where the other foot is. So in this situation, should I just not draw it? You could actually leave it out, but if you just showed a little bit of an evidence sticking out, it would be more than enough. Okay. If I see that my angle is wrong, should I keep going and finish the sketch, or should I start over since once I see my point of view is way off in comparison to the picture? If it's way off, start over, for sure. Try to reposition it, try to find better support landmarks to get comparison of positioning. Draw smaller if you have to. So if you draw too big, it's easy to misproportion and also really easy to misplace positioning of the camera and also these anatomical landmarks. Draw a little bit smaller so you can get the comparison better. Okay, the spacing and the negative shapes will be easier to look at because it's like looking at things from farther away, essentially. The closer you are to it, the bigger those pictures are, it's hard to see all the shapes and length of things because it's such a wide area. So draw smaller so it feels like you're actually a bit of a distance to it. So the tail tucks behind, going this direction, overlapping the forearm. So there's a lot of corrections here that I've made, but I'm not concerned about those the corrections that I had to go for from this circle, from this line here, from the rib cage line here, those lines were existing previously, but I left them and I just shifted things a little bit based on the fact that I recognized proportionally the placement was going to be a bit of a problem. So I forced it the other direction. Should I have thought of like, well, you know, I think it's way too off and I think I'm going to redraw that part. So yeah, of course, that's another option too. You could stop right there and be like, you know what, I can see the problem with this one, so I'm going to redraw it. But in certain situations, I'm also going to test, because if that drawing, if you feel like it's off, I mean, you might as well just try to see if I just moved it a little bit, if I recognize the problem, if it's going to be a huge issue when it comes to the drawing, right? So until I see it, I can't just assume that it can't work. So the idea is to change things, adjust proportion, positioning of stuff. If you're like, okay, now it's way too messy. All right, I want to start it over again. At least I know where things sit better. Let's go to the top of the skull real quickly. I just want to establish a scale. So here, position of the mandible is on that side. Here's the top of the skull on this end, splitting that in half as it comes forward, lower part of the mandible. There. I just want to make sure the scale, the size is, I knew that was going to be a bit of a problem because as soon as I drew the circle, I get the body in there. The common mistake that I make is I make the head size either too big or too small. It's a common proportional mistake that I make. Me personally, even right now, for either like animals or people, it's a common thing that's happened over since the beginning of my drawing phase. I used to do this a lot with humans. I would make their heads too small and the rest of the body would be overly big. Because I sometimes would leave those at the very end. So I would draw the circle or the positioning of where the head is, then I go to the rest of the body. And as I come back to the head, I end up always drawing it way too small. But then vice versa, by saying, okay, I acknowledge that, I understand it, and I would draw the head first. But then I would make the head way too big, and the body becomes really small. So what is a solution then? Trial and error, practice. You know, that's the only way to recognize predicting the issues that you always face. I know that I tend to draw a proportion of the head off. So in this position, I was very aware of that idea. And so what was I doing? I was looking at the other areas of anatomy. This vertical line right here was to tell me the position of where the actual scapula will sit. And looking at the photograph, I can recognize where that position of the skull will be in comparison to other parts of anatomy. So I will draw lines in there to help me fix and position things. But you didn't know this. You could have assumed that this line right here was more for just a structure of the skull. And it is. It's the same thing. It's a dual effective line. It's an actual silhouette of the skull itself, but also a line that helps me compare things around of anatomy. So when people ask me, it's like, you know, how are you not able to structure or construct drawings? If I'm not doing something like this, I go straight for the drawing. But the thing is, I am constructing. You just, I can hide them like this, where it's also dual functions. It's a part of the drawing, but it's also construction at the same time. It's much like how in our rendering practice, we would do things like form shadows and hatching, but then texture, I would connect them as dual actions. I'm basically indicating value with texture at the same time. So, and most people would separate them, hatching and texture. But here with construction, I can also do dual actions as well. Just to explain my thoughts. Rib cage turns in this direction for the simple cross contour. Let's copy and paste this one. Put it off to the side. Again, this is our first iteration, second iteration. Of course, in the second iteration, any changes or adjustments I would want to make, I would want to do so. But let's go back in there and start to refine some of the actual shapes of the bones. Let's take the scapula first. That one kind of sticks out to me. Draw in the shape that best represents it. Not the actual bone itself, but the shape of it. Here is the front limb. Other side. I'm going to shift that down a little bit. Here is the front arm structure. Shape, cylinder, or even plano boxes can be welcome. Cross contour is being used to turn it very simply. This is the lower forearm, which is a dual bone structure. One bone on top, one bone behind. This is the fun thing about anatomy is hopefully it creates a sense of curiosity for you guys. But a lot of it for me was this idea of how, when it comes to like design or even drawing here, you know, I'm looking for things like patterns and, you know, repetitions, archetypes, things that can bridge it over together, you know. And as I look at bone structure, we see so many relationships, and it becomes overwhelming at first because you're thinking, well, if a tiger is a tiger, A horse is a horse. A human anatomy is human anatomy. So you separate them as compartments. And so people feel overwhelmed by the fact that now I got to learn, if I want to draw these things, I got to learn them independently, you know, because they are the independent thing and their information is isolated to that animal itself. So you think of it, it's like, man, now the amount of time it's going to take me to learn all this stuff then. Like if I want to be a creature designer, but also be able to do things like characters, I got to know animal anatomy too, don't I? And so all of a sudden your brain kind of like starts to freak out a little bit because like how much stuff you have to absorb seems, you know, quite massive. And it still is. There's a lot of stuff to really build. It's a lot of stuff to learn for sure. And it does take a large amount of time to be able to retain it. However, to decrease the overwhelming feeling, this intimidation of all the stuff that I have to cover. What we're doing in the class right now is a part to assist in this, which is to find a method or approach, not only to simplify, but to find the patterns within life, patterns within organic and inorganic things. So here, you know, we can find that the skeletal structure has this repetition, and you'll find them in the similarities between all living things. And what I'm talking about is literally, you know, between all living things on this planet, you know, land animals, we share a relationship. And we think of ourselves as humans being so unique and individual and separate, you know, to nature because we are beyond it, right? We think of ourselves as more intelligent. We think of ourselves as more elevated. We think of ourselves as special compared to everything else that's on this planet. So we dominate and we press down, you know, on this resource quite heavily. And so we don't see things like other animals as equal. And okay, yeah, there's a lot of things about us as humans are very interesting and special as well, of course. But a lot of other animals, of course, have and harbor many uniqueness about them, which are individual as well. But those are based on things like adaptation, environment, through evolution and whatnot. But at the baseline, through simple connections of things like anatomy, we can find, you know, this relationship. So if I study things like the skeleton right here, we'll find that the skeletal structure of this animal has a lot of relationships to our skeletal structure. They have similar kinds of bones. Yeah, they're, you know, structured very differently in terms of how they move, their locomotion, the things that they're capable of, size and scale, all these things. But how different really are they? I mean, yeah, of course, we're all vertebrate animals we're talking about right now, land animals as vertebrate animals. You know, invertebrates as things like or the isopods and arthropods and stuff like that. Skeletons is one thing, but as vertebrate animals, we share many things between each other. From, of course, the spine to the symmetry in nature. We are symmetrical animals, okay? So we split ourselves in half. We are mirroring one side to the other, not exactly, not one-to-one, but we are still symmetrical, right? Not only that, you'll find that the bone count is pretty much identical. I mean, what do we have here? We have a scapula to one bone to two bones, all right, forearm structure, which then goes into a wrist structure. All the wrist bones are in there, 5 digits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the arm structure to a big cat, to us as humans, is practically the same. The positioning of the scapula is different, and how it connects into, let's say, a collarbone to the front sternum is different. But in terms of the actual bones and how many they have, and also what they do, similar. Even the muscle structure, they have triceps and biceps, you know. And we have things that are all, like I said, almost equal, identical to the animals that are on this planet that all share it, from reptiles to birds to land animals and equine to the primates to big cats. We pretty much share the same skeletal structure, which has been adjusted based on, again, adaptation of function of how we survive, the environment, the food sources, right? That sort of thing. So we can interconnect it to an animal way back in the day during the Devonian time of old amphibious slash fish that were obviously crawling out of the water, trying to breathe, but also had an adaptation of being able to swim. Here's a hip bone back there. The spine vertebrae goes up this direction. The scapula is a little bit larger, so I'm going to increase scale of that. The fish I'm talking about is one that was discovered probably in the mid-2000s. It was called Tiktaalik. I've talked about this one many times. I would bring up anatomy, but Tiktaalik was an interesting animal because it was a discovery as an animal as a transitional. It's this in-between animal, basically. Like we have certain examples of fossil record of animals out of the water, and then we have also fossil records of animals in the water. But it was really hard to find those animals in between transitions of evolution where they can do both almost, right? And this thing Tiktaalik also did do that. It would be in water, but also on land. But it was one of the first animals that had the structure of this: one bone, two bone, wrist structure, digits. And it had those mainly basically based on theory that it would use that structure to push itself above the water to breathe, because it also had a set of lungs and gills. Here's a plano shape now of the skull as it wraps around with the cross contour. Orbital socket is placed up in here using circles and shapes to represent these sections of the skull. Again, circles, trapezoids, two trapezoids. Here's a little nasal cavity, not nasal, I'm sorry, the sinus sections. Canines are connected there, but let's kind of cut away at the structure of the skull, getting into the cheek bone structure as it wraps around. Notice, again, all my lines are angular, chiseling away like a sculpture. Mandible structure now up there, set of rows of teeth. Now here's the thing, I could draw a skull of a lion for you from memory because I've drawn it so many times. And if I understand this one skull of a big cat, it's easier for me to adapt to a skull of another big cat, which I may not be as familiar and I can find a reference to, but I can build it just as quickly because I'm familiar to what I'm actually building with this one. If I wanted to create my own big cat variation, right? I can understand its general anatomy and bone structure and bridge a lot of that stuff over. So it's easier for me to also create things that don't exist. So then the level of, again, confidence, as we've talked about in the past, continue to just skyrocket and go through the roof. And it builds even more fun factor for me because now there's no struggle. Like, this is not me like trying to struggle my way through to figure out like how to make it work. I don't have to think about that right now. I'm just looking at it, reacting to the shapes, positioning things properly, and I'm able to just talk to you as I'm doing this. Have I drawn this big cat before? This very one? Actually, I have, because I've been to that location many times. But have I drawn this specific angle? No. I've drawn it many times, like from the side to slight 3/4 more to the right-hand side, but also this is a photograph, so the lens captures it differently than how I would see it in person. So let's go to the rib cage as it has cross contour lines. This is the actual sternum section here. Cross contours for, again, rib cage. Going back to the thigh, leg bone that comes up this direction here. To the knee section, again, shapes, circles, and cylinders. Back and heel the foot. The other leg was behind the rib cage over here, but the knee sticks out right above in this section, and the other foot is right here. So I want to indicate where they are, but you barely see it, so I'm just going to leave it as is. Tail continues down this direction. The other front paw foot over here. Yeah, big cats like these actually roamed North America back in the time, and it's amazing how many big cats actually existed all over the globe. All right, shape building right there, right? So again, do I have to now focus on every single bone to study? I mean, you can do a third step beyond this. Let's take this now and shift it a little bit. Hold on, let's merge up these layers for a second. Let me select this one. Let's push it over to our right. Let me grab this one. Let's copy and paste it. Dang it. Why is that? Hold on. There we go. Okay. Let's take this one and treat it as our example. From here to here, we go to 3. If we have repeated again, this one, let's take a little bit further, okay? Junichiro is asking, do you have any recommendations for books about anatomy of animals? Well, I mean, there are plenty of anatomy books that are out there. Do I have any copies myself personally? I actually don't. But are there ones I could recommend? Yeah, for sure. There's one here. It's not necessarily an anatomy book, but they're animal drawing books. Let's see. The first one I could recommend, it's on Amazon right here, is this one. The artist is Joe Weatherly, and Joe is actually a go-to when it comes to someone who knows the animal anatomy really well. And I would highly recommend his, mainly because his method of drawing is going to be similar and close to what the things that we're doing right now, which is the idea of breakdown, simplicity. It's not as structured, I would say, as to like what I'm trying to do right now, because his stuff is a bit more to the gestural side in the beginning. It's definitely much more figurative work and not so much based on things like, you know, shape building in a similar way. It's shape building, but much more loosely in the beginning. And he's able to tighten things up and render stuff afterwards, which does make it a bit hard for some beginners, because if you look at his first steps, it's because he knows anatomy and animal forms that he's able to do that. Or someone who does not, to be able to just gesturally draw the shapes and lines that he has, it's really hard to understand. But if I can show you things like the kind of shapes I want to use, the interconnections of lines, the draw through methods, it does help visualize things a bit better. But for someone who's just gesturalizing some of the lines like this here, like it's there, the whole balloon, string, the shapes. But again, some of these things like, well, here's the leg structure. Well, how long is that? Well, how long do you make it? Well, it's just based on visual. You know, he's just kind of constructing that based on the fact that he knows it. You know, there are other books here, and these ones I'm familiar with also. I'm glad that Amazon was able to give us a recommendation. But this one I also recommend as well too. This one's more based on caricature, but it is construction based. So this one is a bit stronger than Joe's based on his gesture. I like Joe's results better in terms of the end result of the drawing, but the way Ken begins, actually I find a bit stronger. And he also has a little bit more of a dynamic pose to a lot of his stuff. We all come to the same conclusion. Okay, so these books I never owned when I was younger. I know of them. I've never actually even looked at them before. Okay, I know Joe because I've met Joe, and Joe's a great person, and I know of his classes. But I haven't taken a class with Joe. I never looked at his books. I know his stuff because I've seen his drawings. I've seen the covers and pages of them, but I never actually. I don't own the books. I haven't really gone through them. I should, mainly because I need to know more about this stuff. But there's only so much time to know every single book out there, you know. But in any case, based on the things that I can see, it's going to overlap to the stuff that I'm doing right now. It's not exact one-to-one, and again, they're going to be using slightly different techniques of things, but we're all coming to the same conclusion, and also starting with the same idea, which is simplicity, right? So here's another one. This is now straight animal anatomy. I also know of this book. I don't own it, but I do know of it. This is the Atlas book for animal anatomy itself. A tutorial here. Oh yeah, so John is a friend of mine who teaches animal anatomy at the Concept Design Academy and also CGMA. I don't think he teaches there anymore. He might have gone. He might be only at Brainstorm now. But Joe was John's mentor. So Jonathan's method is pretty much almost one-to-one to what Joe does, Joe Weatherly. But John does actually teach a class where Joe only has books. Joe might teach, but I don't know of a school that actually where he goes to. So I don't know Joe that well. I've met him once or twice, but John I know much better. And John's a very good instructor. So John Kuo and I have pretty much started almost the exact same time when it comes to teaching. Like I started at CDA in 2008 in the spring, in January of that year. No, I'm sorry, not 2008, 2010. 2010 of January that year. And John, I think, started around the same time, or it might have been the term afterwards. No, Proco is someone else. Proco is the guy who does all the figurative work. So Joe Weatherly is the animal guy. John Kuo is also an animal anatomy, but John Kuo is really amazing because he's not only a one-note person. Like Joe Weatherly only does animals, right? This artist over here, Ken, only does animals. But John's kind of like me, where we both draw pretty much everything. You know, it's like John knows animal anatomy better than me, but he's also really good at, like, you know, focusing on other things like vehicles and mechs, and because, you know, his work of concept art, he's got to be able to adapt to all those different types of subjects. But like me, I like to draw many other things too. I like vehicle forms, I like mechs and stuff like that. But but he spent most of his time more on specifically animals at the very beginning, and he was able to kind of venture out and do more things. For me, I already kind of started off scattered, but I was more character based, where John was not. Now, one thing that John doesn't do as much is maybe character stuff. He mostly does animal creatures and mechs and props and environment kind of stuff, where I started off more character, and then I went into things like creature and mechs and vehicles and props from there. That's the difference between how we both started, essentially. But we came again to kind of the similar pool as we wanted to go for. Anyways, on top of this one here, I'm going to actually push a bit more detail now. Hopefully some of those books are things you can capture and look at. Some of those I have to get myself still. Maybe I can find used copies at a bookstore somewhere. And some of the cross contours are there. I'm going to start to kind of flesh out some of the inner details. We see this small little teeth in the front. But yeah, Proco, by the way, again, is another great resource for just basic human anatomy. I've met Proco on many occasions, mostly at shows and stuff like this. We'd have conversations and chats, and I'm sure you guys know of like videos and stuff that I've done with him, videos that he will do with independent other people, artists as well too. He does a great job on unifying the community. Very level-headed, smart guy. He can draw well as well too. I don't know what he's done professionally in terms of work, but as an instructor, he's a good people person, is what it is. He understands how to read people, how to work with them. He's a good community builder in that way. But his work is competent, obviously, so he wouldn't be able to do what he's doing if he couldn't do, and back it up in a way. For people that try to like start things, that want to do like, oh, I want to do like a podcast or some kind of like, video tutorial and whatnot. Anybody can do it, and anybody should be allowed to do their own variations of it. But you got to be able to back it up to some degree, so that gives evidence and proof that someone who's watching and listening should afford the time to do so, or want to put the time aside to listen. So someone like Proco, I would say, yeah, is a good candidate where he does have good skills and knows how to speak, knows how to carry himself really well. So here we have some of the spine sections of the bones coming out. This is where I'm not kind of defining individual bones at the moment. To the top of the vertebrae here. So I'm drawing directly on top, and it seems like, well, it seems so much more line, and it's going to get very complex. But once I drop in things like shadow shapes and I group things together, it'll start to fall into place. Here in the ribs, I'm going to draw just a few ribs, just in the front. I'm not going to draw every single rib. A lot of it is also very suggestive, indicative, selection. I'm selecting the ones I want to show you. Cross contours will be left on the back. Just the two ribs right over here, I'll indicate. Because the focal point is going to be here, right? Yeah, and Aaron is also a great instructor, and I didn't actually mention him. I had it in the back of my head, but I forgot to bring him up. Unfortunately, Aaron doesn't have a formatted book that's instructional. He does have books that are coming out right now that are more just like art books. Let's see, he doesn't actually even have it up on his website for some reason. He announced it on his Instagram. For some reason, it's not on his webpage. But he's releasing two books from what I understand. One is like his paintings, and I think another one is like drawings. I think he's doing two books, but I can't remember. Let's see, if it's here. No. But either way, Aaron is a good instructor. Now he doesn't actually officially teach classes per se. He does a lot of like tutorials and lessons of videos, which you can then watch. I do believe he does work with people on hand if you sign up for it. So I think they might have something like that. We have downloads. Again, these are all like video sets, but I don't know if he actually does actual hands-on teaching with people with like feedback and whatnot. Yeah, so absolutely. So that's a good point, Sarah, is that he does a very good job on that stylization because it's geared directly towards 2D animation. And he's very clear about that, it is the art of, Aaron's stuff, but it's more geared towards the animation side of things. So if you want to learn how to do like 2D animation and how to draw animals at first, again, stuff like this is gonna be great. He does offer like more realistic stuff, but like charcoal drawing and whatnot, but it's not gonna go into the structure of how to build these things. This is more just a photo render, right? So you're taking the photograph and transferring it over, doing a one-to-one copy. And those kind of copies are great because these photographs are his. So he's taking the shot, he's taking the photograph, it's his image. So he does a lot of that stuff. And I've gone with Aaron to many locations of travel to explore, and we've gone to Yellowstone twice together. We've gone to Africa together, and it was just me, him, and a bunch of other people as artists to go explore. It's awesome to get to know him because he is a cool guy. He's awesome to talk to. He is very adept of understanding of things like the animal world, and yeah, someone if you want to learn that's just more stylized approach of things, I would recommend him for sure. We call him Brother Bear. That's his nickname because he was a director for Brother Bear. So that's what we just call him. He's also just a big husky guy. He's got a big voice and a very strong personality. Good personality, especially when you get to know him. I kind of feel like Aaron's one of those guys because he has a presence to him that when you meet him in person, that you will find him a bit intimidating. He does have a bit of a standoffish look to him when you see him in person, but he's the total opposite of what you assume. I have several friends like that where you meet them for the first time as an artist and you look at them and you're like, you don't want to approach them because they seem like someone who may not be approachable at all. So here's a bit more definition now. You can see the growth pattern here. What I'm gonna do now is knock in some darks. He's very knowledgeable, absolutely. So right now going back into the head, the focal point, I'm gonna establish my dark shadows first to cast areas, kind of knocking them in, fill, using the same pen, using hatching methods, whatever direction, to go in there and fill these spaces, dark. Establishing the darkest darks. It was really great traveling to Africa with those guys, with Aaron, a couple other people. We had other artists on that trip. I don't think I even talked about this Africa trip with you guys, but I even show you some references if you want to see them, if you want to see it. I have some interesting stories of some of the things I saw with the animals that were there. Yeah, Aaron was there. We had another artist. His name was Darren Bader. Darren Bader is also an art director over at Rockstar, and he was a good friend with a couple people there. He was awesome to get to know. Again, knocking in darks here on the underside of the vertebrae. A few darks here on the other side of the vertebrae. We also had a guy named Greg Beecham, who I never met. He was an older gentleman, probably in his early 70s, maybe early 70s for sure, probably like 71, 72. It seems old, but he was actually very spry, a lot of energy too. I got to know Greg pretty well over that time as well too. Super, super amazing individual. One of the old school guys, definitely old school guy for sure, based on, yes, age, but just in his form of thinking of art, he's much more of a fine artist. Greg Beecham is primarily an animal wildlife artist, and he's been active for decades. AM. His work is mind-blowing. Okay, so all these shots are his own photographs too. He doesn't necessarily do these on live studies and observation. He mostly takes photographs because, of course, to get these shots would be impossible in live. So he has to paint these off of reference photographs that he takes. And I've gone to several locations with him as well. So I went to Yellowstone with him, went to Africa to him, went to Yellowstone twice with him. Not with just him, but it was me, him, and my friend Manny. Manny is the connector between all these guys, between me and them. Manny I met over at Comic-Con many number of years ago. He's good friends with some of the Superani people. Manu is also an animal artist, but he works at a clothing company called Cool. This will give you a better explanation. So Manu is an artist who, him and a few other people got together and started this group called Expedition Art. This is Manny, or Manu, as some people call him. Manny is an artist who has been around the block quite a bit. He used to work in animation and also games as well back in the day, concept art. He also kind of moved into the area of animal conservation. He was really into wildlife work. He's also a falconer, so he likes to hunt with birds as well. He's based up in Salt Lake City in Utah, and he works for now a company called Cool, a clothing company out of all the places. It's like an outdoor clothing company, and he does a lot of art for them essentially. So he's based out there, and I got to know him because of the Super Running group. This is back in like 2015 when I first met him. So I've known him for a good number of years now. So we just got became good friends and got to know each other more. And so he'd invite me out, say, hey, we should go out and do some things over here and there. And we just kind of got to know each other more on that side as well, from travel and animal interests. So he would invite me out to places up in Yellowstone and whatnot. He's like, hey, you should come check it out. I'd never been there. I'd never been there. I was like, yeah, I'll come see it. And we just became good friends. Him, another lady named Christy Tipton. Christy also worked with Manny over at a couple game studios, so she's like a producer. She became one of the board members here. Other artists like David Levy was an amazing concept artist in industrial design at ILM. Thierry was a friend of his from back in the time. Terrell is a part of the board as well too. Aaron Blaze is a part of it. John is the husband of Christy. But these were some of the initial board members that kind of started this project. Now there's many more people that are working with them. So I'm a part of the group right now too. And Expedition Art basically is about artists creating work to bring up awareness for conservation for animals. And they do actual work as well too. Like Manny will travel to Africa and do working with some of the programs out there. Like the last one they did was the rhino wear. So they actually went out there to dehorn some of the rhinos for protection, so that way they don't get poached for their horns. They do this out there. But he was working with them for the animal project or the rhinos. The big cat project, something we're doing right now. The most recent book was the endangered book. So this is all like the different animals that are, endangered animals essentially. And they gathered a bunch of artists together. This is before I had joined them, so I didn't actually do anything with this book. But this book was being sold for different shows, past number of years. But this is also how I got to know him more over the Comic-Con shows. He would go out there to sell this book. Anyways, I don't know if there's anything else here. They talk about how they work. This is all nonprofit kind of thing. Any profits they do make from the books, they send them out to conservation programs. But yeah, it's a cool thing. So I travel with them now as extensively as much as possible. And of course, we were supposed to go last year in 2020 to Africa again, which got postponed. But last year I did a lot of local domestic traveling, just road trips. I would just drive up to Yosemite and Yellowstone and all these different parks. And I would go with Manny. I would actually go with Manny a couple times for bird hunting as well. So we do some of the falconry stuff. I do a lot of photography work. So a lot of it is just photo gathering and just photography study for me. And wildlife is a big aspect of what I like to photograph. From there, this year is supposed to go back to Africa, hopefully in August. If things go accordingly, things like vaccine work, passport, approvals and all that kind of stuff, we're hoping to go. We're already all signed up for it. Greg is planning to go again. I want to go again. Aaron's going to go again. All the usual people. Is the group open for registration? Actually, it is. It really is. So anybody can actually put in a request saying that they want to be a part of the group. But of course, you have to go through some what is that, the filtering process into this. It's not like anybody can just jump in all of a sudden. It's just anybody is open though to apply. But yeah, it is open to the public. Now we gathered ourselves between us initially, but even in our last trip, we had people that were not necessarily artists, but they were friends of the group. Some of them were just regular people. Some of them were photographers and whatnot. But me, Greg, Manu, and Aaron and Darren were the ones just out there to sketch. So we'd be on location in Africa or Yellowstone, and we just draw and sketch. But this is Greg's work. Me and Manu visited Greg last year at his actual studio, which was incredible to see him actual paintings. And these are massive paintings, by the way. This guy is an internationally acclaimed artist, since the 1970s, Greg. And the conversation that I had with him, me and Manu with him, we actually we're trying to start a podcast again, as everybody would say, we're doing a podcast. But this is an art podcast that me and Manu are doing that we're calling Journey Pen. And it's about, the idea of travel and experience as an artist and how we expand on connecting with other artists and people, not just other artists. We're talking to anyone. It could be like nature people, outdoor people, sport people, but as an artist perspective, like how we, process these individuals. Greg was the first one we talked to. And I haven't put the video out just yet. I did finish it. I actually cut it together, edited all that stuff. We have a logo and everything. I have a YouTube video already kind of section put out, but I want to try to accrue many more videos if I can. But Manu has been very busy, so we're trying to find a way to better do this. Anyways, Greg is a cool guy, and you guys should definitely look at more of his stuff. I don't think he doesn't have a book out per se. He does have one from a while ago, but it's more of just an art collection. But he doesn't have like an educational book, unfortunately. He does do workshops based out in his location in Wyoming, and he is a good instructor as well. But he's definitely one of those guys that, when I got to know him more, was always very concerned about his validity in the world today in art, because he sees himself as one of the old school guys, and he doesn't see his placement for the newer generation. He feels very out of place, where a lot of people don't want to buy his work anymore, because it's kind of sad, but his market is literally dying. So the people that would buy his work are so old now that they don't buy his work anymore. They're dead. You know? So the next generation, the children from these people, are not interested in the kind of work that Greg does, or the people that generate that kind of work. It's very like 70s, 80s, 90s, when those kind of like wildlife fine art prints are over there. It still is now. It still exists, of course, but it's not as strong of a market as it used to be, because the next generation just wasn't interested in that kind of work in the first place. Um, yeah, so he's trying to find a new way to break back into the market in different ways. A big aspect to it was like his social media. His son is helping him like really build his Instagram. Like when I visited him with Manny back at his studio, we talked a lot about what he should do, trying to support him and whatnot. So him being a part of it, he really enjoyed being in Africa with us, because he felt like he was being rejuvenated with some of the younger blood to a degree, but also seeing a different area of art and design, because he doesn't know anything about animation or movies or game concept art and stuff like this, where me, Aaron, and Manu were all coming from that field. So he was a little bit apprehensive at first, because he was being a part of a group that was all, entertainment based. But of course, he was very welcome, because we all looked up to him, essentially. Again, right now I'm just knocking in these darks. I want to move into a bit of hatching now. Again, moving with the cross contour, cross contour, cross contour. I'm now going to move my hatching around it in areas. So first, grouping some shadow areas, and then hatching groups, general fills at first, then I'll do variations of value balancing as I go. I'll tell you some stories from Africa, but you have to see the pictures. There are pictures, so I'll do a bit of a picture time for you guys. Let's just spend 15 minutes on it. I will drone on and stop me if I spend too much time, because we obviously have to look at work today, so I don't want to chew up way too much. This one's almost done. I want to do 1 or 2 studies of some of the live animals, and we'll move on. Hopefully you should get the idea. That's what we're doing. But I do want to make sure that you get enough visual information as a demo, so that as you move into the future, you'll have a good representation to figure out how to adapt and apply this stuff into your own work. Let's go back into the shadows and just layer more hatching, stacking it, multiple layers, getting some of the core, or just rebalancing some of the actual values themselves, some darker crevices, giving it a bit of that scale and nuance of the detail of the bone structure. Don't think of it as texture at this size drawing. Okay, just do shadow groupings and smaller indication of edges. But don't think about like, oh, that's a lot of cracks and like surfacing spurs and changes of texture. It's not close enough of a shot for this. So if you guys do full body skeletons like this one here, general shadow indications all you need. Don't worry about texturing, just use hatching. Hatching that would change in value, that would change in density based on layering is all you need to go for. For the side of the vertebrae here, I'm actually moving this direction with hatching. Just do a general fill. And again, there's a lot more detail in the vertebrae than I'm indicating. But that's the whole thing about this again, is that I'm not trying to do an anatomical study. I'm trying to give you enough information to understand how the bones are moving, how they're working. Again, here's one of the rib cage. These are all in shadow. I'm gonna knock them all in. Here, the other side of the scapula. But I will say, the whole idea of community and working in groups together with people was something I mentioned a lot, and something I have to do. Over the many years, I've wanted to continue to really develop my skills on, being able to connect to people, because that's something I just felt like I never really had on point growing up. I was never really good at seeing other people's perspectives, I guess, to a degree. Uh, it sounds a bit selfish and like I was only about thinking of me, but And at the time, I would say that I was more giving, but to be quite honest, I don't think I really was. I was thinking more about, I think, what I needed. It feels like because you're catering to other people's time or requests on things, it doesn't mean you're actually trying to help them, you know? So again, I'm trying to be very open about that. I'm not going to say that, oh yeah, I was just, you know, someone who was very overly too nice and always doing what other people wanted. It was more to the fact that like I was doing it because I was, you know, trying to do it for most on my end to make myself look better in a way, right? I think most people who are a little bit apprehensive, a little bit, you know, let's say nervous or around people, or to, you know, being very introverted, it kind of goes to that, making sure that you feel like you're coming off in a way that is better than what it may appear. I'm not saying all people do this, but I'm saying I think I did. Thinking back, it's always good to kind of like analyze yourself a little bit, and don't be fooled in certain things. And it's okay. I mean, that's the way it was. But people change, people grow, and you become more aware of those things as well too. Can we do a little less render in our homework? Absolutely, Roy. Yeah. This is just a demo. This should show you what's possible. Even if you stuck to number 2 right here with a couple of dark spots inside the shadow groupings is all you would need. That's it. Okay, so a majority of your drawings could stay right there. If you wanted to render something, let's say with a bit more investment within time, what I would recommend you guys do is focus on more like head studies or callouts, an arm structure, a scapula bone, a skull, you know, and because those are a little bit more manageable in terms of the amount of pieces you have to play with. And scaling wise, it's a bit easier to also do. Again, focal point is right in there. For pieces like this, how do you usually tell when to stop rendering? So Carlos, I think a good idea behind this is making sure first understanding where your focal point is. So I'm not going to over render everything, right? So that's one thing, making sure we center and focus it. The other part is making sure that I'm just doing a general separation of dark and light, which I did graphically. And that's it. I don't need to add more, right? Things of nuance and subtlety within areas that I don't really have the space to anyways. So in some of the spots and areas, it's just 2 layers of hatching. 1 layer for general coverage or shadow space, secondary layer for maybe like a core shadow. That's it. I established my darkest darks by filling it in with pen. So that's kind of like some of the cast shadow areas, or, you know, kind of deep core areas as well too. And the hatching is used for like some of the line direction, but I do a lot of grouping as well too. Like there's a shadow side, this is all in shadow, let's just drop it in shadow. You know, even though there's so much more happening on that arm, I made it much more simplistic in terms of view. But to stop, making sure, of course, focal point is in place always, because you can keep going. I could have gone all the way down to the arm, I could have gone to the ribs, all the way to the back of the legs. If I'm not thinking of it, you could be spending hours on this piece. We don't want to do that. So we're going to stop right there. But either way, you can see the actual visual growth with these ones very distinctly. They're all very separate, you know. It's enough information to make sure that the actual development and the details and, you know, I guess the volume and the values are much more delineate compared to, of course, the one before, right? Anyways, let's move on and let's go to one last demo over here, going into live animals, and we'll do a bit of a talk. Let's shift over all these demos over to the right. Let's see, let's grab this image, shift it over like this. Keep that there for now. Let's grab the other references. Let's see, I'm going to grab the side view of the tiger first. Then we'll just do that one running pose. Question from Anara is, are amphibians and reptiles on the table for this week? Absolutely. As a land animal, that's fine. Birds are also okay. Birds are a ton of fun, whether they're flight birds or reptile birds that are flightless. Ostriches, emus, cassowaries are amazing birds to draw. Flight birds, things like, you know, raptors and stuff like this are also really fun as well. Birds are deceiving though. They are much harder than they appear. Their bone structures are very confusing looking. They're very bizarre. There's a lot of parts to them. So I don't know if I would start with animals like that, but they are good for just like observation from the living standpoint, like the actual, you know, flight posing and stuff like this. But yeah, they are difficult, I would say. Anyways, quick study here. Tiger side view, same deal. Bone of the actual balloon, string. The string doesn't have to be one continuous line, by the way. Section to section. Yeah, Roy, bird skulls are great. I find bird skulls to be a lot of fun. Again, skulls of any animals are generally going to be much easier than the entire skeleton. So some of you guys might even end up focusing on skulls for a good majority of some of the sketching. But again, try to always involve a little bit of some of the other stuff, especially when it comes to the actual full body structure if possible. There's that 1, 2, 3 again. Right here, that hump is a scapula bone sticking up. So I know the position now of the scapula. So this is the difficulty of drawing live animals, is that if I didn't study the bone structure, I wouldn't know what some of these shapes were, right? Like right here, this front section is a jutting of the joint structure, which is shifting up like that. So the scapula comes up in this area here. This is a joint that goes back into the elbow, down into the wrist. The scapula is behind this one. Again, the forearm is going to go this direction down to the elbow, down to the wrist. So these things are visually apparent to me now, mainly because I knew where they were from the bone, but I now know where these silhouette, these jutting points, are connected to what bone that I saw earlier. Without knowing that, you can only go by what you see, what's on the surface of it. Because you can't see the underlying anatomy, it's really hard to actually pinpoint what these things are. Like even in the back leg, like if you hadn't studied what the back leg actually looked like, then of course drawing this stuff would be really difficult. Now, Jay is asking, would you study bone structure of an animal before sketching them on location? Yeah. So in the classes that we would have, we would do bone structure first, always. Skeletal studies, prehistoric, modern day. Then we would go to the zoo the following week or two. Because having studied some of the bones at least gives you some referencing of things that you have in your sketchbook that you can take with you on location. So if I knew that at the zoo I'm going to have a bunch of giraffes and zebras and big cats and birds, let's just do a general studies of these kind of animals, skeletal wise, and also some other unique ones I just want to do for fun. And I can take those pages with me and have some sort of reference, right? At least an idea, an experience behind that as well too. But the back leg over here, the hip bone is up in this area. The thigh bone connects over here. This is a knee, okay? That's where the knee goes. This is to the back of the heel, the ankle, which goes into, the foot. So the inner structure of this animal's leg is like that. But without it, when you look at the leg, it's just, this for people. They don't know where the joints are. So they end up creating something very bizarre looking at times. So this is where that when you guys draw live animals, are you allowed to have some of the bone structure next to you to always have as observation? For sure. You are allowed to do that. So here I'm going to draw in placement of the joints. Now, of course, even the ribs, it's not hanging all the way down here, right? The ribs are up here. And this lower hanging is like flesh and muscle and fur, all that stuff that, changes the silhouette of the animal. So I'm going to build it with a line, more of a straight line right there. This goes into another joint. Arm is stretched out forward. Ground plane is here. Rib cage a bit further out, and he's made way too long. So I'm going to adjust proportioning. I'm going to bring him in a bit more. So as I bring in that position of it, here's where the joint would be placed in, slightly angled up. Knee comes down this direction, connecting to the elbow, to the knee, the ankle down to the heel. I'm going to draw the other position of the leg, coming down, across, and forward. This change doesn't bother me, okay? Because it's just me, it's like studying side view. I know that you can be like, but I want to make sure it's clear enough, but this is a sketch to understand. So even if you have areas like, oh, I messed that part up, I gotta adjust it, change it, okay? At least you're showing me that you're catching things. As I do this line, okay, let's just copy and paste this one for the moment. I'm not gonna go in here and actually try to draw the bones, right? I'm gonna go in there to the animal silhouette and now start to draw these shapes that represents the animal's actual living view of things. So the silhouette wraps around, almost two-dimensional cutout to a degree. I'm gonna wrap this front portion, the next section is over here. It is overwhelming, it is. This is not easy to do. Animals can be a lot of fun because people find them interesting, but it's not easy. Things will take a bit of a turn for the worse as we go into the future, especially as we go to things like vehicles. Because the problem with vehicle forms, and this is why most people don't like to draw them, is that yes, we're using a similar mentality, which is the idea of breaking down something simple. But now I'm sure you can start to understand that that's not as easy as it sounds, right? Breaking something down simply is actually very difficult. When something is very complex, when there's a lot of parts and pieces to it, like the bone structure here, there's a lot of layers of construction that goes into this, you know? Um, so Roy says, how do you transition build the skills for drawing live subjects? Notice if I drew 10, 20 pixels, and I could contextualize and move the shape better than I ever have because of that base building, but something moving seems like a world of difference. It is. It's a very hard transition. And this is why when you're on location, you will see the quality of skill drop dramatically, okay? So when I'm in my classes, we'll go to like the museums, like the Naturalist Museum drawing bones and taxidermy of animals, and those are great because they're not gonna move anywhere, they're dead, they're just sitting there. So as a stationary object, you have all the time in the world to just sit and observe and just take the time to draw, right? Even if you are a little bit more on time crunch, you can still, approach it with this sense of not comfort, but with a little bit more relaxation to know that you're able to see what's going on. But in these live animals, that's not going to be the case. These animals are not going to hold the pose that you want, right? They're going to move in the way they want to. Most times, you're not even going to see them at all. They're going to be hidden. They're going to be sleeping somewhere. So you won't even actually see the animal to draw if you want to. So it makes it very frustrating. And I think that's the proper word here, is that frustration, right? When it comes to drawing live things. But that's no different to drawing people on location. So if I'm on like at a coffee shop or a bar, I'm drawing people, the same difficulty lies there because people are not just sitting still. They're having a conversation, they're having drinks, and they're moving around. So you don't have the pose that you want. So inner mentality is I got to be able to see to draw. It's true to a degree. What you have to see though is different. You don't see what is in front of you exactly one-to-one or at the surface level. You see the underlying structure first, which is what we're doing. Because when it comes to this, what is the solution to drawing on location, right? Is it just practice? Is it understanding these animals more? Well, obviously I can't study every single animal beforehand and memorize it and go to the zoo and try to draw those things. Not gonna happen, right? At some point, I gotta just, go to the location and try to draw these things. Or if I happen to be at a location and I have the opportunity, I wanna be able to draw these things. So for me, it's the approach that is the big difference here. Because if you look at the animal and all of a sudden you see this thing like walking, around the enclosure, it's going to be really hard. It's like, man, I can't capture all the things that I'm seeing right now. But what I do first is not start drawing. I look. Okay, I'm watching the animal go back and forth. Most of these animals have usually a cycle, a walk cycle. They'll go from one spot to another one to another one. Unfortunately, as being a part of a zoo, where else can they go, right? But as they do so, you can actually even somewhat predict as they come around, you can see the pose again. As they come around, you can see the pose again. So as you start to see the pose that you want, you're able to visually lock in the balloon string that you want to first. So let's say I saw the tiger walking from a different angle of view. I would say balloon, string, 1, 2, 3. If the animal moved, that's fine. I memorize, okay, the leg position was in the front to this direction over here, leg was over here. And able to lock in a thumbnail, a quick gesture of what's going on. Okay, he's moved now. I can't really see what's going on. I'm gonna wait for him to come back. Comes back, okay, I can see more stuff. I'm gonna block in some of the actual silhouette shapes, positions over here, but your observational skills have to be very strong now at this point. It seems intimidating to do something like this on location, right? And it can be. But what I will also tell you is that, like anything else, it will become familiar. The idea of just being there, trying to problem solve it. Here's the other thing. When you're on location, you're not trying to draw what is. You're trying to understand, just study. So a lot of the drawings that you do on location, you're not going there with the intention of trying to quote unquote finish them, render them. We're not going there to do that. We're going there to see and observe and to study. And so that means a majority of your drawings may come out very minimal. Line, shape, a little bit silhouette, a couple of three-dimensional forms, stop, move on, different angle. That's what you're going to be doing most of the time. So the collection of drawings that you do on the spot with me in the class, if you're on location, let's say we have 3 hours on location at the zoo. Again, you're going to walk out of there hopefully with pages and nothing but thumbnail work. gestures, lines, proportions, walk cycles, or anything like this, but not to like the clarity of the line control that you would expect to have, because you don't have the time to do so, right? That doesn't mean that you can't do studies on location with much more detail. I have, okay? But that's because maybe sometimes what you choose to draw is something that gives you the affordance of that. And so your decision on what you also sketch and not sketch is a part of this. If I'm drawing an animal running around, of course, you're not going to be able to do the things you want to do. But if the animal's eating, just sitting there eating hay, okay, that's going to be a lot easier, right? So your decisions as to what you sketch, what you study, and say, well, that one's kind of crazy. It's like running around all over the place, but I like the animal a lot. You know what? I'm going to take a photograph, or I want to take a referencing of notes as to what the animal is, and I'll look it up later. And I'll find reference photographs and draw it. At least I can watch it. I can see what it actually looks like in terms of movement. I know what the animal actually looks like in terms of life and also the scale, right? I can see certain nuances and personality of the animal. So you pick up and read more things than just about the visual. You start to understand what the animal can be like in a living situation. Based on the experience, you can write down notes. You can try to do a quick sketch if you want to, a couple thumbnails here and there. Take a good reference as to what that is, go home, look up more information, do more studies. So there, the idea of the combination is that you're experiencing things, not just trying to draw pretty things. Does that make sense, Roy? But even though I say that, it doesn't mean that, it's going to be as easy as I mentioned. I'm sure you understand this. But anyways, here is the tiger now drawn in with a side view. This amount of information is more than enough right here. Just line shape, okay? Let's go for the other study real fast. I'm going to put a bit more detail on this one. So same thing, balloon. Like, would I be able to draw something like this on location in the wildlife? Of course not, right? Nobody could. I mean, you could do a gesture of it, but in the midst of while it's running, I doubt that unless somebody saw it. You're not drawing it while he's doing that. You're just watching, you're just watching the animal move, and you're able to build a stronger memory of what you saw, and you would then draw it from memory. But to do it while the animal's moving, I don't think nobody would really go for this, I can't imagine anybody doing that really, because as it's happening, it's literally a split second. The animal is in that pose, he's continuing to run, and the run might happen and might be over in just a couple of seconds. So as you put a line down, it's done. It's already moved, right? So if you didn't look at it, you're not going to know what to do with it. So the thing you got to do is observe. The observation is a key thing. Well, there you go. Right? It is a combo, yeah. But yeah, the observation truly is the key. You got to learn how to just watch and build a stronger visual in your head as to what you're actually looking at. And so that way, if you then draw it from memory, you're able to build it. Here is the hip bone in the back. This is actually a kind of a similar positioning of the other one that I had done, but obviously the pose is different. So let's actually get into the arm structure. Here, I'm going to do a little bit faster gesture, this one. So excuse the roughness, but I just want to make sure that we have the time to talk in a minute here. Let's go to the back leg. He's not like in a full stride just yet. It's like he's just picked up the run, essentially. The photographer just caught him as he like jumped off. Let's go for the head structure here. Big cats can actually draw the muzzle first and kind of box it out. Everything is based on me trying to interpret the shapes, the structure. As the head kind of goes back to this large tuft of fur and muscle on the back end. Looking for any sort of overlaps, central line right there for the chest, as it splits up in that direction. Then the upper arm, which is overlapped by muscle, to the forearm as it comes down, linked by a joint for the wrist. The biceps of the animal are in here. They're in here. This is a chest muscle here. The shoulder sections is like a trapezoid, essentially, kind of like up here. There's a tricep and a bicep muscle inside there too. Big cat muscle structures are kind of interesting to look at. And again, like I said, there are a lot of similarities. Their muscles are called the same thing, all right, as our muscles. Again, cross contour, cross contour. Now, when we were in Africa, or let's say like Yellowstone, would I sketch on location? I would. We did. You know, not only sketch, I watercolor painted on location. Now, granted, a lot of the animals that we were drawing were stationary. So they were either sleeping, you know, laying down, relaxing, because in the Africa heat, you know, it's like it's so hard to move around. They're trying to reserve energy as much as they can. In the instances when we saw them being very active, of course, we're not drawing, we're observing, we're watching, we're taking photographs. Because in those moments, it's impossible for us to draw because a truck is bouncing around and, you know, trying to see what's going on. They're so far away, you know. So would I be sketching and stuff like that? Of course not. It makes no sense. I wouldn't be able to produce anything of value to be able to understand what I just actually saw that I could use later on. The idea is to record or collect information that could be potentially useful for long-term use, right? So I'm filling the memory bank or the experience bank that I can then incorporate for further analysis or study that would help me to understand the animals more or to understand structure and drawing more. That's the idea, basically. The position of this leg is a bit off, but that's okay. So I need to adjust a few things here. The arm is going to be moving back this direction. Leg is going to come this way. Because of the angle over here, this needs to overlap this part and come back here to here. There's a bit of a scale too. So what I can actually go for here is just shift over. Notice I made a couple of lines. In this particular one, I'm not going to redraw on top of that one because there's too many lines right now. So it's not going to work out so well, but I know what I have to do. This one I want to actually build a bit quicker now. 1 to 2 to 3. Elbow section as it comes to the forearm. Position of the leg comes down a bit lower. Let's get the other limb structure in there. Hip bone, again, a bit further behind. Right leg is coming down this direction. Other leg is behind it with the forearm overlapped. So be more conscious of that. So if I build out the shape and the form. Here. Cross contour here. The other leg comes out below here. So that feels better now. I've been finding that if I relax more and think of it more as a way of note-taking, I get better results. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're not putting as much pressure onto the piece to perform in a certain way. When you're going in there to the idea of understanding something, to observe, to experience, your mindset changes. Your goals change. And you take that onto locations, you're able to be more active in production. But not only that, when you're actually just working on your own stuff too, just easier to get things going. So notice the difference between these two. This right arm, I brought back more this direction as it overlaps this bottom leg right here. You see the separation of negative shape right there. So again, it's the positioning of negative shapes. So it's better proportioned and not skewed in terms of aligning the joints. So again, when they're standing still or walking, it's easy to do so, right? Because we have context of like ground plane and how these joints are interconnected. So I just bridge over lines to find the angle and the connection, the distance, and this negative space in between. But when they're running like this here, it's obviously much more difficult. And so we have things like overlap and it's more of a 3/4 view. So right now though, I did take the front joint and interconnect these lines over here. From joint here to elbow, I threw in that line. From wrist to wrist section or the front paw, that line. So if we find out where those joints are, the landmarks, you have to find landmarks basically. Now, fixed landmarks can also even be created by you. For me, I'm using things that I know are constant, joint structures, but some of those joint structures may not be so visually apparent for some people. So if you can find landmarks that you can pinpoint that you can then use, it doesn't, there's no one here that says, or anybody that could say that that you have to always use these systems that are being developed. That's bullshit. You know, it's like you can understand it and you can try it. You can take parts and pieces of it, but it doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. The understanding is I have to approach it with the mentality of accuracy. So to find that, if I know that the landmarks are being used in this technique, well, let's find landmarks on my own as well too. If I can define those by making that kind of decision, it might be more memorable because I'm the one that found it, right? But then there could be someone saying, well, actually, I use that too. Overlaps. People come to the same conclusion. It made the most sense. So here, again, fixating an actual point comes to first what you studied. And right now, if I said, hey, we're gonna just draw a bunch of animals this week, and I gave you this shot of the tiger, most likely people would completely fail it because you don't know what you're looking at, right? I don't know where the actual points of anatomy were. I don't know where certain landmarks were fixed because I couldn't make those choices. I couldn't see it. So certain things do require a path to follow, to build, to understand. So with animals, understanding things like basic, anatomy of bone structure can be good. So is that anatomical study? Yes, but are we doing anatomical drawings? Not really. We're doing anatomy based on proportion through simple shapes, right? I hope that helps a little bit, at least in terms of conversation, what we're talking about. If anything else, of course, it's more studies, if anything else, and repetition to kind of figure out what it is you're even looking at. But I think one of the driving factors that helps a lot of people, again, is the interest factor. The things that you guys are drawing, if you are interested in drawing it, you're going to want to actually spend time to figure it out because you actually find them to be very entertaining and interesting to you. If I say, hey, we're going to be drawing a bunch of trains today, you're going to be like, well, I don't like trains. I think they're kind of dumb. Then you're not going to have the interest mentally to actually, develop the understanding or the time to want to do so. Now, I'm not going to say everybody here is thinking that way. And I'm sure whatever we focus on as an actual subject matter, you're going to put the time in to figure out as best you can. But there are certain things, like for yourself at the moment, that there are things that you like and things that you don't like when it comes to drawing. It's either because it's just really difficult, but why is it difficult? It's because you don't understand it. It's really hard to understand. That's usually one of the reasons why we refrain from doing something. It's just too much time, too much stress. I don't get it, and I'm going to produce something that's going to be terrible anyway, so why bother, right? But that kind of mentality then kind of holds you back on being able to experience the possibility of how you can problem solve, but how that can also bridge from one subject to another, because the stuff we're doing right now applies to multiple different types of things that are out there that we haven't drawn yet. Anyways, this is a quick study of the shape structure. You see this one over here, how I start to mess up some of the areas and start to pinpoint out certain things that I carried over on this side. I adjusted it, made it more accurate. Doing a quicker study because I knew where things were and also what I had to do. We can just accent a few additional details. And then I'll just give you guys a quick study based on site, like on location, like kind of references and photographs I've taken, the kinds of drawings that I've done, the idea of being on location, the reasoning of why it's so crucial for me. I'll throw in a couple more details here though. Real quickly, by the way, when it comes to animals like this or anything else, even like the head studies and whatnot, let's see, let me compress some of the layers, shift it over to right. The kind of shape combination I'm using at the big cat for the moment is this. I did a big circle, okay? Imagine that. Or it could be thought of this way. Think of the cranium, let's say the overall shape of the head, and then another circle. This is what I did with the tiger, all right? This combination of shapes is something I've been able to boil it down to for this particular animal. Now I can use this for multiple big cats. Adriana is saying, it's interesting how the discussion has been of drawing on location, and sometimes you just have to stop and watch an experience. Yeah, because when watching the lesson, I like to try to draw along, but sometimes, oh, I see. Yeah, I understand. I had to move a bit faster on this one because I just wanted to complete things. But it's also because when I do what you haven't seen just yet is the redraw. Because the drawings that I would do as a first iteration, I just copy and paste it, right? For the sake of the drawing, for the time. But when I actually redraw, compared to what I had done in the first iteration, I would normally produce it in terms of speed, usually double, speed, because I kind of know exactly where things are and adjustments to things. I can make faster choices in a lot of ways. Again, it's just a reaction, instant. It's in a moment. But I get that, I understand. But that's typically the way it kind of worked mentally, is that if I do a study of it, I can reproduce it usually in double the speed, and usually just from memory as well too. But this action then becomes crucial. I wouldn't be able to do this if I wasn't making the mistakes here. That's the thing about that. Everybody looks at this and is like, oh, I want to be able to draw that quickly. But you got to be able to do this first. I'm not saying just do this in terms of the actual drawing. I'm talking about making mistakes, right? Making decisions. I know what happened over here. I can see I studied it. I'm going to move this. I'm going to move that. I'm going to shift it over here. Think about scale. Think about this. All that was done in that moment of thought. Went over to the other one. No more thinking. You just do it, right? When there's no activity of overthinking, and it's just the action of it, then there's no hesitation. That's where true speed comes from. Not because you can just move really fast. If you just move really fast, you just make a bunch of scribbles. It's all about the idea of knowing where you're going. The fastest, way you can get to one point is to a straight line, right? As we always say. But to know that point, to know your just destination, is then you can get, to that point faster without getting lost. So with this shape study that I had done, the idea I can redraw these two combination of shapes, right? And by attaching the same construction, so with big cats, I can throw in a kind of a trapezoidal shape up here as it goes to the nasal bridge, the front muzzle down to a triangle for the nose. As it gets to the muzzle, they have the underside of the mandible, the chin. They do have a cheekbone, which a line that splits right here. The combination of the two circles is where I pinpoint the cheekbone structure. They have this large kind of like mass of side lip that kind of juts out. Then the hair. I'm going to talk about hair in just a second, by the way, when it comes to some of the detail. And they also then have a little lump right there on tigers, so big cats. So if you look at the side view of the big cat, again, there's a bump that fits like this. This bump right here is a separation between nasal cavity to the actual cartilage of the nose. So in terms of the bone structure, you would get something that looks like this. And the actual shape right there of the nasal cavity is where you'll see that bump. So in this 3/4 view, this bump exists and you see this line that almost separates the nasal section to the bone area, because this is where the nasal cavity would actually be inside there. For the eyes, what I usually do is draw a circle. I cut a diamond or an almond shape into it, wrap some organic lines. They have a natural kind of brow muscle right up in here, which creates this little slight downturn, which gives them a bit of an aggressive look to them. And the ears that stick up here, here. The whisker lines that come in. I can take this same structure, right? Apply it again. Let's go a bit faster this time, just to plug everything into this. And by adding just one extra component, things like a mane, all of a sudden, we have a different big cat. but the combination of structures were the same. It's because they relate, obviously, as a big cat. And yes, there are minute differences between them. Some of those differences can be more apparent for others that were studying animals like this, but for the general public, for the common person, to them, they are identical in structure. And all I used was a combination of a circle to circle. Now, the thing is, I can move this structure in any angle of view that I want to, and I'm able to redraw it in whatever shot that I want. The funny thing is how you can actually recycle that shape combination for different uses. Again, adaptation now. If I take the two same circles, plugged in a brow, front line, this is where the nasal section is. This is where the muzzle comes down for the mouth. Some ears on it. Give it a mandible and also some side hair. All of a sudden, we have a completely different animal in the first now as a result. Primate. I can take those two same combinations without even drawing any detail, and just by doing this, you know exactly what that animal is. So shape language is the most important aspect of this, simplicity, shape language, and also finding then ways to readapt them together. It's this idea of finding this archetype again, this underlying structure that I can always reuse and have confidence towards. Because if I find that solution and I'm able to plug them into different things, it makes my job easier. I can memorize stuff better. I can move quicker, but it also opens up the amount of things I'm able to actually visualize and draw. Again, as another example, this is one I use commonly in my demos, but it's the one with the equine animal, the horse, or things like zebras. For me, these kind of animals were the toughest things to draw in my initial beginnings. I just didn't know how to deconstruct them. What I did first was go to the details. I went to the anatomy first. I went to the muscle and the bone first when I drew these kind of animals, because I thought, well, that's what I would do to understand these animals, right? You got to know the anatomy. So I studied the actual bones and muscles. But the thing is, I couldn't retain all that information. I produced a sculpture. This is my first term at Art Center. I had to do a project based on design of something. I just chose to do so, and I decided to design a guy on top of a horse, a character. And I figured, okay, I'm gonna paint it up and draw it. And I realized I didn't know how to draw the horse. The class wasn't about drawing horses. It was about drawing like this very experimental, figurative kind of drawing thing. It was a really bizarre class. But the instructor let me do whatever I want. So in the project, I want to do an entertainment project. So as I was designing this thing, I figured like, okay, I need to figure out how to draw this horse, but I can't seem to figure it out. So I'm going to just study the anatomy. So I spent the entire term studying the anatomy of the horse, and I did also a full sculpture. Okay, so this thing was about it was pretty big. I have an image of it in my Instagram. Let me pull it up real quickly for you. I'll show you what it looks like because you have to have context a little bit. It's in my save section, so I should be able to find it pretty easily. Give me 1 second. It is right. Come on, where are you? Sorry, give me a moment. I have a bunch of images I saved from Instagram, things like vehicles and mechs and drawings and portraits. Here it is. So this is the sculpture that I did. Okay, this is in my first term at Art Center. This is 2001. So I was 20 years old at the time. Never sculpted anything to this size at all. Okay, so this thing was probably easily about a good 1.5 feet, 20 inches high. So I sculpted the horse all in Sculpey. Okay, I did the actual rigging and the armature. I built the Sculpey on top, put it in an armor setting, all this stuff. Spent the entire term building this thing. A term at Art Center was 14 weeks. Okay, so 14 weeks I spent sculpting this thing from the ground up. never sculpted anything of this size. I had to figure it out on my own because the instructor didn't give me any actual instruction on this. So I had to just figure it out. I checked out a book of horse anatomy at the library, put that on the side. I just started going at it best I could. I lost it. Sculpture's gone now, unfortunately. But I thankfully have a last picture here. Either way, once I completed, I realized, that took a lot of work, and I feel like I now know horse anatomy a little bit better. Then I took this class. Okay, this is again, the first term was in 2001. I took dynamic sketching pretty much about a year afterwards because I did my first year at Art Center, all the fundamental and basics, and I went to dynamic sketching in my fourth term. So first term was Art Center, fourth term was dynamic sketching. That's about a year in. And we wanted to go draw animals at the zoo. And I realized I have no idea how to draw this thing in person. I have no idea how to draw these animals at all. Because I knew, okay, I've drawn them before, I've sculpted the entire horse, but I couldn't transfer that information over. There was no way for me to actually use it practically. It wasn't functional. So in a lot of ways, that experience, what I did in the beginning, really wasn't going anywhere for me. In the moment for that project, it was useful, but in terms of long-term practice, it had no use. I mean, for one thing, if I kept it up for the entirety of that year of just studying horse anatomy, then maybe it would have kept it even more of a stronger memory to me. But still, to draw it on site, on location, or building it, I had no idea what to do. So looking for things later on, I found out, again, the balloon, and then finding things like planes. I found a kite going into the box, where the box can then move back up into the balloon, finding then side planes, and be on the bridge on ears. But I can take this structure, right, and I plug it into any animal that is in a similar variation. So I can take this and take the balloon. Here's a top kite. Let's extend it a little bit longer. Let's take that front box muzzle and just kind of squish it down a bit smaller into a taper. Let's get that side mandible as it goes into the actual balloon. Put some horns on it. Here are the ears and the neck. The thing about this is that your guys' drawing should be able to communicate the animal even just at the base shape level. You're thinking the animal's details and the features is what's going to sell the animal's drawing, right? As in terms of understanding what it is. It can elevate it in terms of visual quality, but the baseline information should also be already giving that information as to what this thing is. Here's a zebra. If I just plug in some more details, again, I can bring it to life. But the thing is, that same information that I just did over here with the zebra, I can plug in right over here to the giraffe. So finding the solution to one helps me understand the other. This is why I have the ability to draw things on location easier, because first, of course, time investment. Second is because I understand the rhythm and the pattern of things that relate to each other. I don't have to sit there thinking about what is that thing? How do I actually build it? Even if it's something that I've never drawn before, even if it's something brand new, I can find an association to something I've seen before. So even though I haven't drawn it, I can still figure it out easier than not having drawn it at all, right? The beauty of this approach is that I can now build it from any angle of view that I want. Whether it's from this angle, slightly looking down, or looking up. By constructing it, it's easier to me to place construction of all this stuff. Maybe a different animal again. Same combination of shapes. Top kite, let's shorten it. Let's take the front box muzzle. Let's actually make it more vertical. Shorten out the mandibles. Let's put some horns on this thing. Give it a beard. Now we have like a goat or something like that, or some kind of like ibex. It's the same combination. It's just slightly adjusting proportion. So if I can find an archetype for a horse, which applies to most equine animals, an archetype for a big cat, which applies to most of the big cats, I can find an archetype for a bird, which will apply to all the birds, one archetype for the fish, which applies to all fish, one archetype for the insects, that applies to all insects. Then I adapt them based on the visual information that's being given to me by the reference or observation. I adjust based on proportion, extra little bits and pieces that don't exist on all animals, and I'm able to then make it more unique to that specific one that I'm looking at. But the underlying structure that I'm memorizing, which gives me the confidence to build it with the speed that I need to, is already plugged in. It's already known. So again, the human being, if I understand the general archetype of a male to the female, then I'm able to then adapt that to the individual that I'm looking at as a model or a person on location. Everyone's different looking, right? Proportionally. But the underlying structure is all going to be the same. This, again, like I said, is the puzzle piece that helped me connect it all together. It's the bridging factor. This is, again, where true control to a degree can now start to take shape. Where in the beginning, as you understand one thing to another thing, you feel like you're getting a better sense of what's going on, but it's not really, because you're not really bridging information together. You're still compartmentalizing by saying this is this and that is that. But by not understanding the connections to all things, it refrains you from also trying. That car, I've never drawn that car. I don't know how to draw a car. But if I understand the approach, what I was trying to do here, even though they're physically and constructually different, but in terms of what I was going for, what I was trying to do mentally, what I'm trying to understand can be the same. If I understand the archetype of a car, I can apply it to all cars, right? If I understand the history and biology of certain things, that makes me want to know more about that part. Because as I know history of stuff, I can then apply to the modern. So the thinking then is not very complex. If I'm studying something new, brand new, then I will understand it. I know where to begin, right?